Imagine this. You wake up in a quiet house. Sunlight filters through the curtains, soft and golden, brushing over furniture you bought in your 30s because it made sense. You sit on the edge of your bed. Your body feels the stretch of sleep, not the sting of age. But then, something odd happens. You walk past the mirror and catch a glimpse of your face. Not old, not young, not defeated, but not quite alive either. Something in your expression startles you. It's subtle, but profound. You realize you've been moving forward, but not necessarily living. And in that brief, still moment, the question creeps in. Is this it? You're not drowning. You're not in crisis. But you're floating in a kind of slow, invisible forgetting, not of facts or names, but of yourself. The fire that once burned to become something has cooled into a silent ember of maintenance. Maintenance of careers, relationships, mortgages, waistlines. You're more stable than ever, and yet less certain than you've ever been. Strangely, you don't feel old. Not in the way you once imagined 40 would feel. Your desires haven't died. They've just grown quieter, like musicians waiting for a conductor who never returns. You still feel the pulse of youth under your skin. Strong, warm, impatient. But society told you that your 40s were for settling, for diminishing returns. That urgency, passion, and exploration were the domain of your 20s. And yet, some nights, lying awake, you sense something radical forming, a new energy, a second wind. But how do you reconcile it? You're supposed to be past your prime, and yet parts of you feel like you're just arriving. You're told to accept your limits, but you've never been clearer on your strengths. You're urged to slow down, but you feel like running again. Why do you feel more alive now, just as the world begins to call you middle-aged? There's a paradox at work. The body may have a few more aches. The face may carry traces of time, but internally a revolution brews. And that revolution has no name, no guide, no cultural roadmap. Because everything around you insists, this is the beginning of the long decline, that your best ideas were already lived, your great loves already spent, your golden days already past. But deep down you know that's a lie. In fact, what if, just what if, the 40s aren't the beginning of the end, but the true beginning of something far more profound? What if your 40s are not the autumn of life, but the second spring? What if everything you were taught about aging, about purpose, about potential, was not only wrong, but designed to keep you from realizing the most powerful truth of all? That your 40s are your new 20s, not because you're trying to relive your youth, but because you are finally ready to live without apology, without permission, without illusion. But why now? Why does this shift happen quietly, universally, and yet so unnoticed? Why do so many people feel this internal stirring in their 40s, only to suppress it, rationalize it, or medicate it into silence? Could it be that culture taught us to fear this decade because it's the one in which we finally become dangerous again? Because we are no longer naive, but no longer bound? Because we now know who we are, but still have time to choose who we want to become? This isn't about chasing youth. It's about confronting a forgotten truth that we age into power, that clarity, self-ownership, and inner fire don't fade. They ignite in midlife when illusions have burned off and all that's left is you, stripped of pretense. And yet, almost no one talks about this. They speak of midlife crises, not midlife awakenings, of buying sports cars and fleeing responsibility, not rediscovering purpose and daring to reinvent. You're not having a breakdown, you're having a breakthrough, but it feels lonely. because there's no cultural ceremony for this kind of rebirth. There are no rites of passage for the second becoming. So you begin to wonder, what else have we been lied to about? And more urgently, what happens if you ignore this call? What does it cost to silence this second wind? What does it cost to obey the world's script when your soul is finally writing its own? You begin to sense this isn't just about you. It's about a generation waking up in unison, looking around and asking, what the hell happened to our lives? And more importantly, what do we do now? If your 40s are the second 20s, they come with a new kind of fire. Not blind rebellion, but conscious defiance. Not chaos, but clarity. Not potential, but power. So here you are, not starting over, but starting right for the first time in your life. And the only real question is, will you answer the call? Because if you don't, what waits for you on the other side of this moment is not peace. It's numbness. It's sleepwalking through decades you could have claimed as your most vital, your most honest, your most alive. And now, your pulse quickens, your mind stirs, because somewhere inside, something sacred remembers. You are not finished. You are just getting started. Now, let's uncover what's been holding you back all along. There's a strange kind of prison that's hardest to escape, the one you don't even realize you're in. You don't see the walls. You don't hear the locks click shut. You just slowly forget what freedom felt like. And perhaps the most dangerous thing is, you start calling it normal. By the time you reach your 40s, you've been thoroughly conditioned, not just by society's expectations, but by the unspoken metaphysics that govern the modern world. A metaphysics of resignation, a belief, subtle, pervasive, that time is your enemy and aging is a slow erasure of meaning. You're told, in your 20s, explore, in your 30s, settle, in your 40s, maintain. But ask yourself, who wrote that script and why do you trust it? To find the roots of this deception, you have to go deep. Not into pop culture or productivity gurus, but into the dark undercurrent of the human psyche, into the thinkers who dared to ask, what is the point of it all? Take Carl Jung, for instance. He said, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. But what about you? What is the greatest burden you now carry? It's not the weight of failure or age. It's the burden of having half lived, of having survived instead of truly existed. Jung understood that the psyche doesn't age linearly. Midlife, he said, is when the second half of life truly begins. The phase not of external achievement, but of internal integration. And yet, instead of crossing that threshold, most retreat. They cling to the identity that once made them valuable in the world's eyes. The career title, the relationship role, the social status. They wear these as armor, not realizing the enemy they fear is already inside. You are both prisoner and guard. You keep yourself small because somewhere, long ago, you were told that dreaming big past a certain age is foolish, that reinvention is reckless, that passion belongs to the young. But here's the truth. Youth is not an age. It's a temperature, a state of intensity, and most people burn cold for most of their lives. Nietzsche warned of this sleepwalking state. The snake that cannot shed its skin perishes. And what is your 40s if not a sacred moment to molt? To let the old self die, not in bitterness but in devotion to the one you are becoming. But there's fear. Of course there is. Fear of starting over. Fear of judgment. Fear of irrelevance. And underneath it all, fear that it might be too late. Yet that fear is not your voice. It is the voice of Schopenhauer's will, the blind force that keeps us clinging to habit, to safety, to the familiar, even when it suffocates us. Schopenhauer believed life was suffering driven by desire, and many took that as nihilism. But maybe he was just pointing to the cost of unconscious living, of letting life pass by while you remain a ghost in your own story. Because what really dies when you stop answering the call to change, not just your dreams, your vitality, your sovereignty, your very aliveness. Think of Viktor Frankl, who found purpose even in a concentration camp. He argued that the human being is not driven by pleasure, as Freud claimed, nor by power, as Adler insisted, but by meaning. And meaning, Frankl said, often emerges only after suffering strips away the false selves. This is what your 40s offer, not an identity crisis, but an identity opportunity. But society has no language for this kind of renewal. It sees youth as potential and age as decline. This binary robs us of the richest years, when we've finally suffered enough to know what matters, and still have the fire to chase it. Even Aldous Huxley, in all his dystopian foresight, understood this, that society's greatest danger wasn't catastrophe, it was sedation, a life anesthetized by routine, a culture that mistakes comfort for joy, that medicates the soul rather than healing it. And you've felt that numbness, haven't you? That eerie sense that despite the career progress, the vacations, the family photos, you've wandered from something essential, a silence that grows louder with each year you ignore it. Because the real crisis isn't that you're aging, it's that you stopped becoming. In your 20s, the world told you to become someone. In your 30s, it told you to stay someone. But now, in your 40s, it's time to become no one again, so you can become someone truer. That's the philosophical twist. The ego you built in early life, the you that tried so hard to succeed, is now the very thing standing in your way. And this is where Sartre comes in. His notion of bad faith wasn't about lying to others. It was about lying to yourself, pretending you're bound by a role you've outgrown, hiding in identities that feel safe but dead. You tell yourself it's too late to change. But what if that's the greatest lie of all? What if the real danger isn't the risk of change, but the cost of not changing? Because make no mistake, you are changing, whether you choose it or not. Cells die, relationships shift, time moves. The only question is whether you will participate in that transformation or be dragged by it. Here is the hidden problem then. We live in a society that has taught us to fear the second half of life, when in fact, that's when the soul begins to speak, and most never hear it. Or if they do, they dismiss it as a midlife crisis, a phase, a glitch in the matrix of routine. But it's not a glitch, it's a summons, a call not to replicate your 20s, but to transcend them, to live with the intensity of youth, but the wisdom of experience. To chase wonder, not for approval, but because your soul demands it. To burn, not out, but brighter. And so you stand now at the edge of a threshold few even see. A point of no return if you are willing to cross it. But beware, not crossing comes at a cost. And that cost, we're about to see just how devastating it can be. You don't fall all at once. You fade. That's how the unseen consequences begin. Not with a scream, but with a sigh. Not with a breakdown, but with the small, barely audible death of possibility. One tiny surrender at a time. You start by turning the music down a little. You stop asking big questions. You smile politely instead of laughing loudly. You stop reading the books that disturbed your certainties. You glance at the stars less often, and worst of all, you no longer ask who you're becoming. And this is the seduction. The world doesn't destroy your spirit by attacking it. It lulls it to sleep. It hands you comfort like a narcotic. It says, "You've worked hard. You've earned this. Stop reaching." But the soul never stops reaching. It just goes underground. And when it does, it doesn't disappear. It rots. Because meaning doesn't die in chaos. It dies in silence, in waiting rooms, in the soft hum of autopilot. This is where the real danger lies. Not in suffering, but in numbness. You wake up one day and realize you can't remember the last time you felt awe, not satisfaction, not distraction. Awe, that sharp intake of breath that reminds you you're alive. When was the last time something made your pulse race, not from fear or urgency, but from wonder? Here's the quiet horror. By your 40s, many of your neurological pathways are well-worn highways. Your brain favors efficiency over novelty. It defaults to patterns, same thoughts, same routines, same emotional responses. It rewards familiarity, not aliveness. Neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to change, is still there, but it no longer happens passively. It has to be willed. You have to fight for it, or else over time you become a walking archive of who you used to be. The danger is not aging, the danger is calcifying. We tend to think of stagnation as stillness, but it's not still. It moves just downward. The loss of drive, the thinning of joy, the growing emotional fatigue, they're all signs of a soul whose wings are breaking from disuse. The world will never scream at you to awaken. It will whisper to you to sleep, and that whisper sounds a lot like, "You're doing okay." But okay is not a life. Okay is a padded cell made of middle-class comfort and Instagram highlights. Okay is what happens when you forget that time is not a resource. It's your only real currency, and you're burning it right now without realizing it. This is not drama. This is biology, culture, cognition. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. When a person, conditioned by disappointment or perceived limitation, stops trying to change their circumstances, even when escape is possible. It's not that they can't move forward, it's that they don't believe it matters anymore. And here's the brutal twist. This psychological resignation is more common in midlife than any other phase. Why? Because by now you've gathered enough data to build a story. You say, "Well, I tried. I failed. This is just how life is." You've seen relationships break, careers disappoint, dreams dissolve. So you start telling yourself that ambition is naive and settling is maturity. But that's not maturity. That's despair wearing a tie. That's the existential drift that Jean-Paul Sartre warned us about, the slow loss of agency when we abandon our ability to choose. We become what he called serial beings, not humans in charge of their destiny, but chains of repeated actions. You don't live Monday, you repeat Monday, then Tuesday, then 203 Tuesdays after that. And culture makes this worse, because it doesn't just allow your stagnation, it celebrates it. Stability becomes status. Predictability becomes virtue, and discomfort, that becomes pathology, something to medicate, avoid, suppress. Ask yourself, when was the last time you were uncomfortable on purpose? Not for survival, but for growth. Because if you're not choosing your discomfort, it will choose you. The hidden consequence of ignoring your second wind is that entropy becomes your lifestyle. And entropy doesn't shout, it whispers, "Just stay right here. This is good enough." But good enough is never enough for a soul still awake. And here's where the paradox sharpens. Most people in their 40s and 50s aren't dying of heart disease or cancer. They're dying of quiet desperation. It looks like overwork, like alcohol that starts at one glass and slowly climbs, like numbing through Netflix, scrolling, consumption, like short tempers and long silences in relationships that used to be alive, like pretending your sarcasm isn't sadness in disguise, because the pain of unrealized potential never leaves you. It just changes shape. It becomes fatigue. It becomes envy of the young. It becomes passive-aggressive comments at dinner parties and unspoken grief on birthdays. And here's the terrifying part. This is all preventable. But prevention requires confrontation. You must look at what you've become and ask, is this who I wanted to be? Not just on the outside, but in your inner life, your imagination, your beliefs, your capacity to feel joy like a lightning strike. And if the answer is no, then you have to face the next question. What the hell are you waiting for? Because every year you ignore the call, the muscles of your spirit atrophy, not beyond repair, but beyond familiarity. You forget how to run towards something unknown. You forget what it feels like to jump before you're ready. You forget that every breakthrough in your youth came not from planning, but from leaping. This is not about some dramatic overhaul of your life. It's not about quitting your job or moving to a yurt. It's about refusing to live another year as a stranger to yourself. It's about not mistaking comfort for contentment. It's about recovering your birthright, aliveness. Because if your 40s are your second 20s, then this is your second chance. And if you let it pass, the consequences will not be obvious. You won't explode. You'll fade. Your voice will grow quieter. Your dreams will grow dimmer. Until one day, you'll look in the mirror and see not a person aging, but a soul vanishing. And you'll wonder, when did I disappear? But it doesn't have to end that way, because now that you've seen the cost of staying asleep, you're finally ready to wake up. And when you do, the rules begin to change. The rebellion begins, and the fire returns. There comes a moment, a pulse beneath the skin, a flicker in the eye, when the silence becomes unbearable. You hear it, the ghost of your own voice, not yet extinguished, calling, daring, whispering the most dangerous word in any language. More than this routine, more than this muted joy, more than maintenance and monotony and the gentle decay disguised as adulthood. You don't need permission to want more. You need courage, because this is where the rebellion begins, not with a dramatic gesture, but with a refusal to keep living as if the best has passed, a refusal to believe that age is a closing door, a refusal to accept that the soul must dim just because the candles on the cake have multiplied. You stand on the brink of your second wind, and unlike the naive momentum of youth, this one is forged, chosen, summoned. It begins by breaking the first and most powerful spell, the belief that it's too late. This is the lie that holds millions hostage. But here's what they don't want you to know. The most extraordinary transformations don't happen in youth. They happen after the world assumes you're finished. Harlan Sanders founded KFC at 65. Toni Morrison published her first novel at 39 and won a Nobel Prize decades later. Julia Child didn't master French cooking until she was 40. Nelson Mandela walked out of a prison cell at 71 and changed the world. These people didn't find some magic formula. They rebelled against the narrative that their time had passed. And they did it not with the recklessness of youth, but with the focused rage of someone who has nothing left to prove and everything left to express. That's your power now. You don't need external validation anymore. You've seen the game, played it, lost it, won some. You know what applause feels like, and how hollow it is when it's for the wrong performance. So you stop performing. That's the rebellion. You stop contorting yourself to fit a life that feels too small. You stop editing your dreams to make them digestible. You stop apologizing for the fact that something inside you refuses to die quietly. Instead, you begin to shed, not recklessly, but ruthlessly. You shed roles that were never yours, friendships that drain instead of inspire, habits that numb instead of nourish, expectations handed to you by parents, culture, younger versions of yourself that didn't know what they know now. And as you shed, you begin to hear a new sound beneath the noise, the thrum of becoming. This is where rebellion becomes creation. You no longer want to go back to your 20s. You want to reclaim their fire with your current depth, to marry the courage of youth with the clarity of experience. You don't need to burn bridges. You need to light beacons for yourself, for others, because the moment you choose aliveness, you become a threat to every system that profits off your silence. You stop buying what you're told you need. You stop aging gracefully and start living ferociously. You stop asking if you're too old and start asking if you're too bored. And boredom is a sacred clue. It is the soul's protest, the creative tension that says, "You're underusing me." So you feed it, not with distractions, but with risks. The risk of learning something new, not for career advancement, but for joy. The risk of speaking truth, not to dominate, but to finally be real. The risk of looking foolish, not in pursuit of perfection, but in honor of curiosity. This is the sacred discomfort that rewires the brain, that reclaims neuroplasticity, that rebuilds passion pathways long thought dormant. And this is where the rebel becomes an artist. Because to truly break free is to create, not just paintings or music or companies, but moments, conversations, ways of being, and the rawest, most intimate art of all, the redesign of your own identity. You are not finished. You are being reauthored, but the page won't write itself. You have to lift the pen. And to do that, you must first unlearn the stories that said your prime had an expiration date. Here's a counter story. What if the second wind is actually the real life? What if everything before now was just scaffolding, necessary but temporary? What if your 40s are not a second act, but the first time you perform as your real self? Because now you're not becoming what the world wants. You're becoming what the world needs. Someone awake. Someone with fire in their veins and no time for bullshit. Someone who can walk into a room and not care about impressing, but about impacting. That is the new currency. Presence, wisdom, depth. You don't need to run faster. You need to walk straighter, not toward expectations, but toward meaning. You rebel by choosing integrity over image, and you will lose things. Comfort, familiarity, perhaps even people. But what you gain, that's the quiet miracle. You begin to feel alive again, not in nostalgia for the past, but in reverence for the possible. You reclaim time, not as a countdown, but as a stage. You look in the mirror and no longer see a timeline. You see a threshold. And on the other side, the life you were always meant to live. So burn the map. Trust the compass in your gut. Let the fire rise, because this rebellion, it isn't just about you. It's a signal to others who are quietly dying inside that they don't have to. It's a torch in the dark for those who forgot they could still run. It's the call to arms for a generation that was told to wind down, when in fact they were just beginning. And once you hear that call, you cannot unhear it, because it's not coming from outside. It's coming from the deepest part of you, the part that never stopped believing you were meant for something more. And now you finally understand. You are not lost. You were just preparing. And the wind is rising. There is a moment in the rebellion when everything goes quiet. Not the quiet of defeat, the quiet of arrival. You've broken the spell, ripped through illusion, stared into the mirror not for what's been lost, but for what's been waiting. You've torn down the scaffolding of who you were supposed to be, and there, beneath the noise, beneath the years, beneath the conditioning and compromise, you find yourself, but not the self you once were, not the version built by youth's ambition or culture's blueprint. You find the self that has always been whispering beneath it all, the one who was never confused, never afraid, never asleep, the one who is simply waiting for you to stop trying to be someone and start simply being. And when you feel that presence, not as a concept, not as a motivational cliche, but as a quiet, unshakable knowing, everything changes. Here is the ultimate truth. You were never meant to peak in your 20s. Your prime was never meant to be defined by age, metabolism, or how much potential others saw in you. Your prime is the moment you stop living someone else's story and start living your own. And for most people, that doesn't happen at 25. It happens now, because it takes living through the noise, through the masks, through the heartbreak and the hollow victories to finally arrive at the threshold of truth. You are not here to perform. You are not here to conform. You are not here to age gracefully, as though vitality were a crime. You are here to wake up and then light up everything around you with that awakening. Here's what no one tells you. You're more dangerous now than you've ever been, because you no longer chase approval. You no longer need applause. You no longer mistake comfort for purpose. You are no longer seduced by the temporary. You're ready for the eternal. Not in the religious sense, but in the way that real moments are eternal. When you're fully alive, fully honest, fully unmasked. When your presence vibrates with something unalterable. When your laugh is your own, your values are not borrowed, and your dreams are no longer outsourced to the expectations of others. You are, in this moment, your own revolution, and it feels like peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the absence of self-betrayal. That is the deepest fatigue of modern adulthood, not overwork, but self-abandonment. The spiritual exhaustion of pretending, complying, suppressing. But when you drop the mask, when you finally stop negotiating with fear, your energy returns. Because your energy was never gone, it was just being spent on survival. Now it's returned to its rightful purpose, expression. And with that comes a truth so radical, it feels like a secret. You are not behind. Let that land. You are not late. You are not past your prime. You are not a could have been. You are perfectly positioned. Because what matters most is not when you arrive. It's that you arrive awake, fully, willfully, with eyes wide open. And now that you're awake, you can see what was always true. Your 40s, 50s, even your 60s, they are not a decline. They are the ascent. But this ascent has no summit, because the point was never arrival. It was becoming, and becoming has no age limit. So what do you do now? You build temples out of every day. You make your relationships sacred by showing up without pretense. You say what matters even if your voice shakes. You dance even if you look foolish. You study something new not because it makes sense, but because it makes your cells hum. You ask, what sets my soul on fire? And then you fan that flame without apology. And when fear shows up, and it will, you greet it like an old friend. You say, I know you. You used to run me, but now I ride you. That is the ultimate shift. You stop being driven by fear and start using it as fuel, because fear is not the enemy. Forgetting who you are is. And now you remember. You remember that your life is not a resume, it's a resonance. And the more true you are to yourself, the more the world begins to echo back a frequency that feels like home. You see it in your children, or your art, or the strangers drawn to your authenticity. You see it in the morning light that no longer feels dull. You see it in your reflection where regret has been replaced with readiness. Because here's the final paradox, the one that rewrites everything. The moment you stop trying to matter is the moment you begin to. Not in the way others taught you to, but in a way that ripples, in a way that lingers long after you're gone, in a way that makes your life not just impressive, but meaningful. And meaning is the thing we were all after all along. Beneath every career move, every relationship, every risk and retreat was the search for meaning. And here it is, not in some distant goal, but in your very breath, in your very willingness to be present now, not halfway, not cautiously, but with everything you've got. Because now you know the truth. You are not running out of time. You are running into yourself. And that is the most exhilarating discovery of all. So let the world keep its timelines and titles. Let it chase youth like it's the only currency. You are not chasing anything anymore. You are claiming your second wind, claiming your second fire, claiming the truth that your story doesn't have an ending. It has layers. And this layer, this one is the most alive, the most powerful, the most you've ever been. So step forward, not as someone re-entering the world, but as someone reborn within it. Let your breath be your anthem. Let your actions be your prayer. Let your days be your proof. Because the question was never, are you too old? The question was always, are you fine?